New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to be looking at the Unobstructed Way, and I'm talking about the extraordinary and very influential, but now forgotten, largely, writings of Stewart Edward White, who back in the 1930s and 1940s wrote such important spiritual texts as the Betty Book and the Unobstructed Universe. My guest today is Ronnie Pontiac, who worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He has produced award-winning documentaries and has written articles for several esoteric magazines. He is author of American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife Tamra, Lucid, who is co-author with him of The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, a new translation for the modern mystic. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Ronnie. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Always an honor to speak with you, Jeffrey.
And I know our topic today is dear to your heart. You've written extensively about American Metaphysical Religion, and I know that this chapter of the Betty Book and the Unobstructed Universe, the writings of Stewart Edward White are very dear to your heart, and they're high on the list of metaphysical systems that you appreciate. And I have to say, I was exposed to them, at least briefly, back in the 1970s, when my then mentor, Arthur M. Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, spoke very highly of these teachings. And to the best of my knowledge, Arthur, who traveled the world and met the metaphysical teachers of his era in the 1940s and 50s, undoubtedly must have met the Whites.
What a lucky man.
Yeah. Well, he was a very fortunate man in many, many ways.
Well, of all the amazing stories that I encountered in years of exploring esoteric knowledge that resulted in the AMR book, this one, when people ask me, what's your favorite? And I have several, of course, but I can say without hesitation that my absolute favorite is the story of Stewart Edward White and his wife, Elizabeth Grant, who is better known as Betty White. I call her the other Betty White. They were not only amazing people, the lives that they led were incredible, but the teaching is so profound, and the way that it reflects other teachings, Plato, as we'll see later, The Secret of the Golden Flower, it actually sheds light on practices and beliefs that existed hundreds of years before in different continents. It's amazing.
Well, one of the things you can say right off the bat about the Whites is, like so many of the other people you wrote about in your book who had, let's say, checkered careers. I mean, some of them were fascists, others were power-seeking individuals. There's a certain purity that comes through in the life of the Whites. They were obviously very upper class, very affluent people, but they weren't striving striving for power, or I don't even think they were striving for influence. They just wanted to share these extraordinary experiences that sort of happened to them.
It's one of the things that moves me most about them. I think it's why they were world famous back then, but today they're almost completely unknown. They didn't establish any organization. They didn't have kids who inherited copyrights and tried to profit off them. They just created this work and then threw it into the river of time.
Well, let's start with Stewart.
The first thing I want to say, just so people know what we're talking about here, is a general statement about what they were doing. Their work is concerned with that moment of human life that is described in the Tibetan Yungdrung Bon scripture, the precious garland. And there it says, in the process of death comes that moment, quote, when consciousness remains as an orphan with no support, end quote. And that is absolutely what the Betty books are about, is what happens to us when we leave our bodies, we leave the world of our memories and our connections and our home, everything that we have been supported by that helps us to feel comfortable in the world that we identify with as ourselves. All that's gone. And then we're an orphan trying to understand where we are and what happened. And Betty was taught how to go back and forth over that threshold, both in life and then after death. And she tries to teach us what they called spiritual sure-footedness, so that when you cross over like that, and also in life, you have this awareness, this higher awareness, which, as we shall see, is very similar to the secret of the golden flower, this idea of the unobstructed consciousness. But again, their individual lives, just incredible. So let's go into Stewart, as you suggested. These were seasoned world travelers. A famous writer, his brilliant wife. They were a romantic couple, sipping champagne on a yacht, headed for Alaska. No one else on board except a cat. They were hikers in the wilderness all over the world, from America, Africa. Their own story, without anything supernatural, is worth telling. So Stewart was a red-blooded, old-school, no-nonsense American, an outdoorsman, a dedicated conservationist. Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, listed Stewart as one of 6 naturalists to whom he said we owe a real debt. He also called Stewart the kind of young American who's making our new literature. And in his autobiography, writing about his Sagamore rifle range, Teddy wrote, quote, the best man with both pistol and rifle who ever shot there was Stewart Edward White, which is quite a statement, because he knew a lot of good rifle marksmen. When Stewart was a young man, his grandfather had established this business. He came to Michigan at the right time, which is when Michigan was about to become the lumber capital of America. And America was building up, towns were coming up everywhere, and they needed lumber. Well, Granddad set up one of the first sawmills in the area, and also acquired a lot of acreage so that he had the trees for making the wood, and it made him a millionaire. Stewart's dad was sort of the guy that was running the show, and he raised Stewart and his brother so they would have a great familiarity with all of these businesses that they became involved in. So, for instance, they had invested in a gold mine, and Stewart was sent to look around and to make sure the family wasn't getting cheated. And this was like in the wilderness. And he found a lawless frontier. His family was getting robbed blind. And Stewart actually had to face down a lynch mob because the criminals were lying about him and saying that he was going to withhold payments and all of this. He was very cool about it. He let the local law enforcement take care of it. And it turned into a book that he worked on. He'd already written a couple books. He was working as a lumberjack in the snow He would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and write until 6 a.m. before working. And the book was called The Blazed Trail. And it was all about this gold mine experience. And it became a bestseller. He became a really well-known author with that book, and then wrote a series of books that were very well-known and very popular with outdoorsy people, with young people, and were made into movies and TV shows by Disney. So this guy had experience not only with lumber mills and gold mines and being a lumberjack, but also he had served during World War I. And he was a very well-known hunter. He filled a hall with taxidermied trophies, animals that he'd shot on safari and in America. And he was sardonically humorous enough to name it the Ark. It included a leopard that he strangled with his bare hands when this unfortunate cat attacked a member of one of his expeditions while he was on safari. And just so everybody knows, because I found it all very disturbing when I read that about Stewart, but Betty convinced him to give up his gun for a camera. So when he would go with Betty out into the wilderness, he didn't take the gun to shoot animals anymore. He would only shoot them with a camera. He's the kind of guy that once he was on a trail and he broke his leg out in the wilderness, he dragged himself home for miles to get to camp. And along the way, he stopped to shoot a game bird so that there would be dinner. I mean, he was just this really can-do kind of outdoors guy. He was the first white man in Tanzania, or one of them, Tanzania, and he mapped it. He was the first person to map it in 1913, which earned him election as a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. I say that he approached Betty's mediumship the way he did Tanzania. Very practical, detail-oriented explorer, never giddy, very open-minded, but also with a good skeptical head on his shoulders. The key year for him is 1903. This is the year when the opera star Enrico Caruso recorded his first 78s for RCA. Influenced by Nietzsche and the culture of ancient Greece, Isadora Duncan invented free dance that year. But you get a feeling for how quickly the world was about to change when you look at the names of some of the people born that year. John Dillinger, George Orwell, Anais Nin, Bob Hope. I mean, a completely different world was about to happen.
And when was he born?
He was born in, what's the exact date? I think it was 1879, somewhere in that area, toward the end of the 1800s. In 1903, he graduates with his master's degree. So that tells us we're probably talking about the 1880s, somewhere in there. I'm thinking it's 1879. He got a master's degree from the University of Michigan. The Blazed Trail became a bestseller in 1903. His parents had retired to Santa Barbara. He visited them. He'd been vacationing there and had learned all about this disappearing ranchero culture, which he wrote books about. But the first big thing that happened besides those things was that Theodore Roosevelt happened to be passing through Santa Barbara. And he heard that Stewart was in town. Stewart had written him and said, I wrote this book, maybe you'd be interested. And Theodore wrote back and said, I've already read it. I love this book. And then when he found out that Stewart was in town, he said, you've got to come on the train with me. And so they talked all the way to San Luis Obispo, and they became very good friends. Such good friends that Teddy Jr. grew up to write a book about Stewart, right? And Stewart did what he could to moderate Teddy's notorious disrespect for indigenous people, for example, because Stewart had great respect for indigenous culture. But the real reason that 1903 was so important, I mean, he would go on safaris with Teddy. I mean, they had a good relationship. But it was that year that he met someone much more important to him, Elizabeth Grant, who was the love of his life. And it took him a year to convince her very wealthy parents that a rough fellow from the frontier like him, and a book writer to boot, I mean, terrible, should be allowed to marry this carefully cultivated upper-class gem of a daughter that they had. And they must have been dismayed when the newlyweds announced that they were off to have a honeymoon hike in the wilderness of California for 4 months. And this was just Betty and Stewart out in the wilderness. And Stewart was amazed at how she adapted. She just loved being out there. And he soon discovered that that was her attitude about pretty much everything. So Europe's at war in 1914. The Whites host a benefit food drive for Belgian victims of World War I. And Stewart understands, I think, that America is headed for this war. So in Santa Barbara, he recruits this military unit called the Grizzlies. And he says in a few weeks that he was, with his friends, able to sign an entire battalion. And these were the kind of soldiers that Teddy Roosevelt liked. These were hard-bitten cowboys, as Stewart put it, rangers, out-of-door old-timers. And they had a song called the California Grizzlies. And it had this line in it that it kind of tells you where people were at, or at least he was. We're fighting for democracy. Human rights, our battle cry. And when old glory leads us, we'll conquer or we'll die. So they saw themselves as going into World War I fighting for human rights. And from 1917 to 1918, he joined the Grizzlies, fighting in World War I as a major in the 144th Field Artillery. In 1919, just after the war, Teddy Roosevelt died. And Stewart had great admiration for this man. You know, he was so exuberant and vital, and taught him to be bully. And Stewart used to say bully, like so many people did in imitation of Roosevelt. And he spoke at Roosevelt's funeral on a cold January day in upstate New York. And he was now 45 years old. And I think his thoughts really turned to mortality at that point.
Would it be fair to say that up until that time, he really demonstrated no particular interest in the spiritual life or the metaphysical life?
Very much so. In fact, he says in one of his books that he thought it was all already decided. It's nonsense and fraud, and that's all there is to it. So, yeah, he had no interest in this stuff. So how did the greatest love story in American metaphysical religion begin? Not their meeting, but the metaphysical side of it actually began at a dinner party. Some friends pulled out a Ouija board. I often hear people say that only bad things come out of a Ouija board, but there's at least this exception and several others that I found. And he was into it, but Betty was very reluctant. He tried it out for fun. It was very facetious and frivolous. They didn't even use the planchette. They used a whiskey glass. And when the glass moved, Betty just thought they were playing a trick on her. So she watched from a distance and she ignored them when they were saying, no, this is real. It's really moving. And it all seemed to be very enjoyable until the glass very firmly spelled out, "Why do you ask foolish questions?" Well, Betty thought this was still just a joke. Well, now the glass started spelling her name out repeatedly and urgently. Betty, Betty, Betty. Well, you can imagine she thought, oh, come on, guys, you're just trying to get me to do it. But she decided she wanted to show them that she wasn't afraid, and she joined in. And the glass started spinning in circles. He said, like a happy puppy. And there was a new message that was repeated over and over again. They couldn't get any other message. It was, get a pencil. And that message was for Betty. Well, Betty blew it off. But a few days later, she was alone at her desk, and she was feeling foolish doing it. But she had a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. And to her shock, her hand started moving. Involuntarily or unconsciously, she was experiencing automatic writing. Messages from the other side. They were delivered one sentence at a time, but in one great big run-on sentence. No punctuation, no spaces. So she takes it to Stewart. Well, he's intrigued, and he starts to puzzle out the words and see where these sentences end. And they discover that these messages are very apropos, and they're deep, and they invite further exploration. So these spirits say, don't call us spirits, we're the invisibles. By 1923, he's so into it that he's now a research officer for the American Society of Psychical Research. And in 1925, he publishes the first book based on Betty's work, and it's called Credo, and it's published in this kind of, I'm not telling you who the person that channeled this material is. I won't give you any details like that. I'm just going to talk about the philosophy of it. Well, everyone's shocked. The book was successful. And even the people that loved him as a writer of frontier and Western stories, they were very intrigued by it. A couple years later, the Boy Scouts of America designated for the first time the distinction of the honorary scout. And they had 18 people they gave this to. One of them was Orville Wright, and one of them was Stewart Edward White. So he was held up as this paragon of Boy Scout virtues. By 1928, he had another book called Why Be a Mud Turtle? And this was a little folksier and more accessible. And this really struck a chord with readers. So now the Whites decided, let's really dive into this and do some real research into this stuff ourselves. They joined up with Joan and Darby, which is a nickname. Joan and Darby in the old days meant a happily married couple. And these people were actually very successful business executives, very ethical and well known. But on the side, they had their own channeling experiment going on with allegedly Joan was the medium. And they wrote a very famous book called Our Unseen Guest, which was a bestseller about a soldier speaking from beyond the grave. Joan was famous for writing, by the way, a classic book on quilts, one of the first serious studies about quilting in America. They were also joined by Margaret Cameron, who channeled a book called The Seven Purposes in 1918 that was published then, right after the war. And that book correctly warned the world, a world that was deluded. You know, people thought that World War I was the end of all wars, that humanity had learned and would never have a war again. And in this book, The Seven Purposes, the spirits were telling Margaret that there was a bigger, darker war coming. And that the purpose of the channeling was to help more people understand death, because so many people would die in that battle, and that would decide the fate of humanity. Betty and Stewart, they had these weird experiences that like really got Stewart, because Stewart continued to kind of be skeptical on a level. He kept saying, well, maybe this could be the unconscious, maybe this is telepathy or something. But experiences would happen. One of my favorites is Betty liked to channel blindfolded, so she was completely without distractions. And Stewart would be quietly writing notes off to the side. He reports that one time he wrote the word attitude instead of altitude, which is what the spirits were intending. And blindfolded, Betty said, no, it's not attitude, it's altitude. Well, that gave him something to think about. He thought, well, could it be telepathy? But there were so many experiences like that he says that he became convinced, because he said, one time, two times, maybe it's a coincidence. But when you have 100 of these inexplicable experiences happening during the process, something's going on that defies what we would consider a normal reality. So in 1936, their friends on this side and the other, who were so blown away by where this teaching was going, how amazing it was, they said, you've got to reveal who's doing this. Betty deserves credit, and you have an audience here that's eager to find out more. So there again, he kind of copped out a little, and he didn't say it's Betty, my wife. He simply said that there was a medium he was working with and that he'd been working with for a while. Betty book was a smash hit, classic of spiritualist literature in 1937, a bestseller, all of it. So they start working on a book called Across the Universe. And Betty becomes ill. She suffered 2 months before passing. and the publication of Across the Unknown was delayed because of this. And Stewart wound up having to add an afterword titled I Bear Witness about what had happened, which I'm about to tell you. And it was an extraordinary testimony of love. I mean, really quite beautiful. Stewart explained that the Invisibles had recently announced that the work would now take what they called a new approach. They admitted that it might not be comfortable, but it was the only way to achieve the full blossom of the great experiment that they were all involved in. Stewart had no clue what they were talking about. 2 weeks later, after that was said, Betty suffered terrible pain. Took her to the doctors. They diagnosed a very serious condition. So Stewart now believes that curing Betty must be the new approach. He believed that their loyal readers would be disillusioned if they could not accomplish her healing. And he admits that he dreaded separation. They've been married for 35 years. They've been apart only 3 times. Twice when he was exploring uncharted Africa, and once when he served during World War I. And he describes in that book, Across the Unknown, his adventures with her. It's pretty amazing. He says, years of pack horse travel in the Rockies and Sierra, the cattle ranges of Arizona before the movie companies came, 14 months in Africa, 16 seasons in Alaska, here, there, and everywhere in the wild and tame corners of the earth, and adventures also among people and ideas, and for 20 years, the pioneering in these strange, dim regions of the higher consciousness, end quote. And he says they knew that there would be no permanent separation, that they'd gone far enough to know that they were going to be together, whatever happened. But he also admits that he never was able to completely lose his dread of just being apart from her. He thought, my existence is going to be so dismal, and the emptiness left by this wonderful, amazing woman who's so funny and happy and brilliant. And she, he says, had traveled so much between the obstructed world and the unobstructed that she did face her illness and her impending departure with a serenity that he did not have. She fought to live on, but she was doing it for him. And he records this heartbreaking conversation with regret that he had not yet realized his selfishness was hurting her. She once told him, I could go so easily at any minute. I have to fight against it in the night. And she asked him a little wistfully, if it came about that way, you wouldn't mind too much letting me go, would you? And he, in his ignorance, he says, replied emphatically, I most certainly would mind. And so she suffered for 2 months of terrible pain that left her weak, thin, and worn out. This woman, amazing woman, filled with energy. Everybody commented on how she never seemed to age a minute. Now I could only whisper single words, and she had to gather strength between each word. One night, the doctor entered her room. She managed to smile, but she seemed to slip back into unconsciousness. And watching this, Stewart suddenly realized what he was doing. He left the room. He took a seat in his favorite easy chair, and he decided that the mission that the Invisibles had wasn't worth this. And he projected consciously his thoughts to her, and he explained to her, if it's your time to leave, then you should leave, and I release you gladly. The doctor enters a minute or two later and tells him it's over. But the doctor looks confused, and he explains that Betty had woke up, had spoken as clearly and buoyantly as she had always been, and had said out loud, it's all right. I've had a talk with my boy. You can take me now. And then she was out. So Stewart, he was surprised that death, which he had been fearing with this horrifying gravity, that it also brought a peaceful acceptance along with the grief. And then he says, I'm going to quote him here because this is amazing. He says, "This next is very difficult to convey." He asks us to remember, quote, "the cozy, intimate feeling of companionship you get sometimes when you are in the same room, perhaps each reading a book, not speaking, not even looking at one another. It's tenuous, an evanescent thing, one that we too often fail to savor and appreciate. Sometimes, in fact, it takes an evening or two of empty solitude to make us realize how substantial and important it really is," end quote. He reminds us of this bond of intimacy created by mutual habits and traveling together, by conversations and all the intimate moments of being a married couple. And he points out that all of these contacts are aimed at what he called that rare inner feeling of companionship suggested feebly in the sitting by the fire idea. He says it's the only way we overcome the obstruction caused by the barriers of encasement in the body. So here he is explaining what happens next. Well, within a very few minutes, that companionship flooded through my whole being from Betty, but in an intensity and purity of which I previously had no conception. It was the same thing, but 100, 1,000 times stronger. And I realized that it more than compensated for the little fact that she had stepped across, because it was the thing that all our physical activities together had been striving for. But compared with this, they had only gained it dimly and in part. He says, "Does this sound fantastic? Maybe, but it's as real and solid as the chair I'm sitting on. So much so that I've never in my life been so filled with pure happiness. No despair, no devastation, just a deeper happiness than I've experienced with her ever before, save in the brief moments when everything harmonized in fulfillment. And furthermore, it has lasted, and it is with me always." That always gives me chills. And it was so dramatic, by the way, that he was accosted out on the street by a supposed friend of his who was eager to hear that he was grief-stricken and that his belief system had been dashed to pieces by her death. And when he encountered Stewart in the state of ecstatic comfort with the events that had occurred, he actually ran home to reread the Betty books. So he figured this was what the Invisibles were after. That this proof of survival he experienced, which he put into this book, Across the Unknown, in this afterword, I Bear Witness, that this was the message that the Invisibles wanted to send. But that was the end of the book, but not the story at all, because the blossom that Betty and the Invisibles had in mind was much more than just this bearing witness. Across the Unknown came out, it was on bookstore shelves in August of 1939, just a matter of a few weeks before the Nazis blitzkrieged Poland and World War II began. So Stewart is now convinced of her survival. He has her continued presence, her companionship, stronger than ever. It's intimate and unique, and it comforts him every single day. But his friends ask him, why are you making no effort to reach her through a medium? He later admitted to his readers that he was afraid. What if she didn't communicate? What if the communication was so obviously inferior it could put doubt into all their work together? And he saw himself, would he search vainly from medium to medium the rest of his life, trying to find somebody that could channel Betty? However, he didn't want to stay home either. They had this beautiful home in Hillsborough near San Francisco, and these incredible gardens, because she collected seeds from Africa and all over the world that she brought to Santa Barbara and created these amazing gardens. And there's a very famous tree, for example, in the middle of the big plaza in the middle of Santa Barbara that she brought the seed for. And there was a famous Italian botanist who she brought back all these things for, and his place is now a garden there. And Stewart noticed that the plants were dying without her. So he had plenty of money. Even during the Depression, he was making money from his books being made into movies and such. And so he hired the best people, including this Italian botanist, and no one could save these plants. It was like they were dying because Betty wasn't there. And they wanted to be with her, and they didn't care to survive otherwise. So it was a very lonely thing for him to deal with this. And he decided about 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor that he would travel through America visiting friends who wanted to console him, because everybody was writing and saying, you've got to come stay with us. He saved Joan and Darby for last. He knew there would be a session of channeling, because that's what they did. And he immediately said, Joan, don't make any attempt to reach Betty, please. Okay? And she said, no problem. We'll talk to my spirit guides. We won't talk to Betty. The second she went into trance, Betty crashed the party. And she began by saying, Stewart, which was Stewart's nickname that she'd only used for him in private, which kind of blew his mind right there. And then she provided all the proof he could want. And in the Unobstructed Universe, he writes that this is one of my favorite passages from their work. He says, Betty began talking to me quietly, fluently, with assured and intimate knowledge of our common experience and living. There was no fishing, no fumbling. That part of it became almost ridiculous. It was so easy for her, where with usual psychical research it had been so difficult. Here in this first evening, she literally poured out a succession of these authentications. She mentioned not one, but dozens of small events out of our past, of trivial facts in our mutual experience or surroundings, none of which could by any possibility be within Joan's knowledge. And through Joan, Betty also talked about shared personal experiences that embarrassed Stewart. And Betty had to reassure him, Joan's not going to remember any of this. It's okay, I can talk to you about this. So she also says to him, there's a red lacquer box that Joan bought, and she's very confused about it. She bought it for me, and I want you to pay her back. And this is a present for my younger sister, Millicent. The important thing is the carving of the birds on it. Okay, so Stewart takes the box after he pays Joan for it, and he goes to visit his sister-in-law. And he says, did you ever talk with Betty about a carved red lacquer box? Millicent says, yeah, when I visited you on the coast in 1936, we saw one in Chinatown, and I was crazy about it, but it was too expensive. Later, I thought it over, and I wrote her asking where could I get one. I must have written her 3 or 4 times, but she never answered my question. So then Stewart says, Millicent, Betty emphasized the importance of the birds. Well, Millicent takes a close look, and she realizes that these are swallows, and she starts crying. And then through her tears, she says that when they were children, her older sister Betty, every spring, would help Millicent climb into a tree where they would watch fledgling swallows nesting. So cute. So there was a lot of these kinds of things going on. According to Stewart, these impressive examples accumulated into several hundred that were equally good. And then he said what followed was 40 sessions of communication with Betty. 40 sessions with her unseen presence, from turn of phrase and mode of thought to her own special brand of fun and laughter. And not only that, but now friends and acquaintances and even strangers were getting in contact and saying, I just had an experience with Betty. And some of it was this same glow of happiness that Stewart had described. She would show up in dreams and converse with people. She played practical jokes. There were emotional epiphanies, even from strangers would write and say, I was talking about this other person named Betty, and then then I know it was your Betty came in and she helped me with this problem. And he was getting all of these letters in. So he later wrote a book called With Folded Wings. And in it, he remembers this woman that he loved so much. And I'm going to give some of his descriptions here so we can really visualize her, because she's, to me, she may be in some ways the most important figure in AMR because of the success of what she accomplished. There's nothing like it that I've seen anywhere else. So he says, as I said before, that they explored Alaska and Africa, as well as the border between life and death. He says that she was half Spanish and half Scottish, born on the Isthmus of Panama, raised in Newport, and married a Westerner. Her mother was Roman Catholic, her father a Scotch Presbyterian, and she was brought up Episcopalian. He used to tease her about it, that she was a little bit of everything. He also teased her because she was a little woman. She always said, I'm 5 feet tall. And he claimed that for 30 years, he made her a standing offer of $500, which was a lot of money back then, for herself or her pet charity, if he would be allowed to measure her, because he was sure that she was 4 foot something. She always turned down the offer, and with dignity. And he says that she was beautiful, though, that she had such a harmonious her proportions and her face, and she carried herself with this lift of the head. And although she was tiny, she was often called exquisite by people. And he says, that's not just me saying so. This is what people said about her over and over again. And as mentioned before, he said that she seemed to have the secret to perpetual youth, because until her last illness, when she was 59, she was slender. Her hair stayed as abundant and brown and soft as it had always been. She never even got a gray hair. Her skin was smooth. Her cheeks were shell pink. He said that this was not his fatuous, as he put it, opinion, but the occasion for wondering remarks by so many of her friends that he had to believe it was factually true. He also says that she always had a good time, that wherever they went, whatever challenges were put in front of them, even when she was ill, she had this zest for living and this joie de vivre that was something that lit up his life. She used to say that old age is what happens when you, quote, stop looking at things. And he also talked about this one gift she had that was quite extraordinary, and that didn't show up until she started living with him, which was her incredible kinship with animals. He said that many, many times he would come around the bend of an Alaskan river, and there would be Betty sitting on the bank talking to a raven that was about 2 feet away from her, squawking at her, and they would actually be talking. But the minute that the raven saw him, it would just fly away, even when he was 100 yards distant. And he described an incident in Alaska with a Kodiak bear. He was no longer carrying a rifle. He had a camera. They're walking upstream, and then all of a sudden they find 1,000 pounds of bear moving downstream toward her, way too close for comfort. He was very scared for her. And then he says that she said, now you are a nice bear, but you go away. Go away, she repeated more sharply. The bear stopped. He says it looked at her to see if she meant it, and then dropped his ears like a well-mannered dog and turned off and went into the brush. He saw her do this with yellow jackets and all sorts of animals. She could tell the yellow jackets had got on their yacht, this isn't a good place for you. You need to leave. And they would leave. And then his favorite story about this was once he and some friends went to the zoo with her, and they got in front of the lion cage, and she seemed saddened by seeing lions behind a cage, since she had seen them in the wild. And there was this great big lion, this male, who was dozing, very bored looking and very oblivious to all the people. Well, she sat there for a while looking at him. And then she got to her feet and started to walk away. Stewart says the lion opened his eyes, got up, followed her all the way to the end of the cage, lifting up his head and staring at her as far as he could to see her in the crowd. And then he sighed and he laid down again and closed his eyes. So he and his friends went running after Betty, and they said, "What did you do to that lion?" And she said, "Well, I made him pictures so that he could see the African belt." That tells you what kind of person this was. Truly a sweet soul. And her poetic sensitivity to natural beauty, her wholesome, humorous advice, all of this was eagerly read by a nation at war, in mourning, that found hope in this revelation that the mysterious medium Betty was none other than the wife of this famous writer beloved by generations. This is the amazing thing, Jeffrey. He could have built a metaphysical empire from this. I mean, these books were world famous bestsellers. They couldn't keep Unobstructed Universe in print. It went into, I think it was something like 7 printings in the first year, or 8 printings. And he didn't really do anything with it. We have this wonderful record of his secretary, Mrs. Leslie Kimmel. She was there at the end of his life after Betty was gone, and she reports that he had an aversion to meddling in other people's affairs. He liked to read, he liked to watch movies, he liked to garden, and he would dictate letters, giving advice to the hundreds and hundreds of people that wrote him at first every week and then every month. And he would always encourage them to find their own path. And Kimmel described him as reticent, shy, very quiet, but very confident, with a genuine interest in anyone he was speaking with. She also said he had a light touch, which made him a popular dinner guest because he was very humorous and had insight into all the aspects of life. And she said that no matter how vividly he felt Betty's presence, that the life that he shared with her for so many years was over. In this big quiet house and the garden, and it was all fading. And she said that the loss of her and her physical presence, so vibrant, was something that you could see in his face even, that he was just saddened by not having her around. He did spend an hour every day meditating in Betty's blue room. He said that he always felt her presence especially strong there, and he did receive instructions. Eventually, he even started to channel himself. And these private interviews he was granting to people started to happen. And there's one that's very moving about the younger sister of a soldier. And she has a dream about him. And the soldier says, "Find Stewart Edward White and talk with him." So she obeys this and she finds Stewart, and she actually shows up at his door. Well, Stewart immediately understands what's probably going on. She says, "Can you tell me how he's doing?" And he says, "No, I'm sorry, I don't do that. But let's talk about death and dealing with loss." And so they had a long conversation. And sure enough, when she got home, she found the telegram that her brother had died before the dream that she had had. So he dies. She has a dream about him telling her, "Go find Stewart Edward White." And she wrote to Stewart, "I don't think I could have handled it if I hadn't had that talk with you. And thank you so much for helping me understand and that he's still there, and to have faith in all of that." And he would, whenever people approached him about, "Let's do a school, let's do an organization, let's put you on a lecture tour," no. He said gently, she said, his secretary, but determinedly, he discouraged all such efforts.
And yet, Ronnie, at the same time, wasn't the idea that Betty's death and her continued communication after her death was to be part of a great experiment that the Invisibles, as they called themselves, were planning?
Yes, absolutely. They continued the books that came out after that, which were inspired by her and by other spirits communicating from the unobstructed, went into far more depth, and also really spent a lot of time talking about the war and about soldiers and the fate of soldiers who are suddenly killed and what it's like for them when they cross over. And she even mentioned that it was kind of a burden on the unobstructed side because there were so many souls coming over. And she said that normally when a soul crosses over, they are met by, especially in violent circumstances, they are met by people who have special skills in the unobstructed, who can look at your life and pick out things that make you feel safe and can help you realize what's happened and that you're okay and that there's help for you now in the unobstructed to develop a new life. But that there weren't that many souls available who had the skills to do that. So it was a difficult bureaucratic situation, World War II, as well as a tragedy for humanity.
Now, you've used the term unobstructed quite a bit, referring to what we might call the other side. So why unobstructed? I haven't heard that term used elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the teachings, and that's a perfect place to start, right? Yeah. So the idea is it's not two universes. It's one universe with different frequencies. The obstructed part of it is comparable to like a laboratory or the holodeck in Star Trek. It's a playground for consciousness to learn and to individualize. So in the unobstructed, everybody's working on the obstructed. And Betty said, a lot of the ideas that your geniuses have come from us. And so she said, it's funny to sit there yelling in some guy's ear all day. And then he goes, hey, I've got an idea. And she said, you'd be surprised how few of your geniuses are originating these ideas. They're coming from the unobstructed. And she described the obstructed as being like this huge art project, like a group art project. And it was a place where the infinite can pretend to be finite, where the timeless can pretend to be ephemeral. And so learning and individualization can occur. And we'll discuss how that happens because they went into great depth. So the unobstructed is our natural state. And it's in every way comparable, as we'll see, to the secret of the golden flower, to the golden flower itself. In both cases, we have a consciousness that is not obscured by matter. And so is therefore capable of being anywhere, being everywhere. Unlimited consciousness is our natural state, and it's unobstructed. We can move through the material world. We can experience aspects of it. And so it's all part of this grand project that everyone's involved in.
I'm under the impression, however, that it's not as if as soon as you die, you have perfect spiritual freedom to do anything.
No, actually, Betty described a couple of things. One, as we'll see, she talks about how she had to begin with what she called a molecule or atom of consciousness. That was her unique perspective, her consciousness in this giant ocean of consciousness. And it stayed. It doesn't disappear. It's what it is. But she said that she felt naked, that she felt like so helpless, like an infant, because all she had was the consciousness. But with the help of guides that she'd been working with when she was alive, they taught her how to use the experiences of her life in order to start building her body, her world, her ability to function in the unobstructed and to influence the obstructed. But it took time, even for her, with all that training, to develop those skills. And she also said that there are people who live what she called gelatinous lives. And what that means is that's somebody who never, ever, really does anything to build their character or to understand the soul. They just enjoy their life, maybe. They do what people do. They have hobbies. They compete for jobs. They try to make money. They go through each thing that life has to offer, but without any character building. And when they die, they don't know what's going on. It's much like the Tibetan bardo. Their own fears, their own experiences and memories pop up as living creatures in their experience, and they can be very frightened of their own mental creations, and they just kind of bounce around in this chaos until they're born again and have to go through this whole process one more time, hopefully this time to develop an awareness of this unobstructed side of themselves, or what the Golden Flower called the higher soul, that remains aware of its true self, while the lower soul suffers in claustrophobia, keeping the body going and sustaining it through time.
One of the things that really got my attention in your writing about the unobstructed universe was the idea, I believe Betty communicated this after her death, that she had, as I recall, an alpha body and a beta body, two different bodies.
Yes. So the alpha body is our physical body. And it's sort of our first, we have to build that so we can function in the obstructed world. We have to learn language and all the skills that have to happen so we can function in the obstructed. But there's also the natural body, the beta body, which is it's not made of pieces like our body is in incarnate life. It's one thing. And it's a body of light. And it has color that reflects its level of development and whatever it's feeling at the moment or thinking at the moment. And so when she's recovering that body, it's like all her attention had gone into being the physical body. Then she suffered through the dissolution of her physical body. And now she finds herself as this atom of consciousness. And she is trying to regain herself, which is this body of light. But she is at first unable to do that. And a gelatinous soul has no chance of recovering that body of light because they don't have the concepts to be able to experience it. So how do we experience the unobstructed is the next question, right? Like that's what their teaching was all about. How do you get this so that you can, as Plato said, philosophy is learning how to die before you die. And that's very much what the Whites are trying to teach you, is how to have that consciousness. Same thing with the Golden Flower, the idea that you can wake up that soul that is aware of the unobstructed world. And from that, your view of life changes radically, as we discussed in another talk that we had. So you change from the lower soul, which tends to be afraid of life and angry and lots of grievances and really attracted to death and to destruction and murder because it represents freedom from this claustrophobia. The higher soul loves life. It's this miracle, this amazing creative experience, interactive experience. And we cherish, when we have that consciousness, every aspect of it. So how do you gain that understanding? And what they said was, it begins with something very simple, which is relaxed appreciation. They talked a great deal about this. And relaxed appreciation was how to start meditations. It was how to begin all prayers. Stewart said, cultivate the feeling you get when you admire a beautiful sunset, or if you're enjoying the sound of frogs chirping in the night, or as he put it, a good old pup walking in front of you, wagging its tail, leading the way on a walk. And he says, now notice when you do this, how your senses expand. You experience what you were missing when you were wrapped up in your own thoughts. So sometimes we can be walking outside and we don't hear the birds singing. We don't see the tint of the sky behind this lush hill. And these small wonders, when we notice them, refresh the soul and they help us to connect with the unobstructed. And they warned that if we don't build this, then our soul itself turns into what they described as a dehydrated husk. Right? It's been starved almost out of existence. You never lose it, but it doesn't do anything. It's just sort of dormant. And this is, again, not about a different world, but about frequencies. So the frequency where the dead exist is not visible to the living. we are at a much lower frequency, Betty taught. And that the world that she was now inhabiting in the unobstructed was vital and filled with pure conscious energy. But she also insisted that everything in this world, an electrical current, a hunk of granite, a bee that buzzes by, every variation of matter at the center of the particles that make forms, consciousness. That's what makes anything exist in the obstructed world. There were 3 sentences that really stand out in their works as the aphorisms that kind of describe where they're coming from. The first was, consciousness is everything. So we are moving in a conscious dream here in the material world. They also said, attention is existence. So the way that we take on a life is by giving attention. And we create in this life by giving attention, and we create in the unobstructed by giving attention. And finally, this bold statement that the individual is immortal. And we'll look into that a little bit more deeply in a moment. So what is the purpose of all this? Betty said, explaining from the afterlife, that the purpose of the unobstructed universe is to give birth to and to individualize consciousness. All matter is born in our universe, in the material universe. Nothing is lost. Individuality is not lost, though in its lower forms, it can be burned or turned into a gas or what have you. It can change form, but it's all kept. The highest form, the soul, goes on undivided. And she said, your scientists have accepted the law of the indestructibility of matter, but I say to you that this law is only a corollary of the indestructibility of consciousness. End quote. So what she's saying is kind of like we're all immortals who have forgotten what we are, which takes us back to our discussion about Orpheus and the idea that we're actually children of the gods who have forgotten that we have this eternal soul. And from that point of view, I would like to point out that the institutions of the great religions that set up shop as gatekeepers to paradise are really selling water by the river because no one has a monopoly on rites of purification or human transcendence. Paradise is there within us. It's there for all of us. It's our heritage. It's waiting to be remembered. There's no special formula. There's no, we have to do it this way. This is in us, and we can have this experience. We're supposed to. So if we die in forgetfulness, if we're gelatinous, the details of life fade into objective history. They exist in time, influencing all the future, but they no longer exist for us as a personal memory. And when we reincarnate, we get a new set of circumstances, new loves, new families and friends, new favorite pets, new hobbies and talents. There can be a great awakening when the soul recovers all the memories of all these lives. But until we achieve that, at each incarnation, we start all over again. And the risk at being here in this material universe is what they call the vortex. The vortex is like the lower soul in The Secret of the Golden Flower. It's a world where we're swept away. You know, I would describe it as you get news that's alarming, and then suddenly you're worried, everything goes wrong, and you don't have faith in what's going to happen next, and you're scrambling. And many human beings live in that way most of their lives. And in the vortex, we learn to be mean to each other and to be mean to ourselves. And we don't appreciate that we are these eternal souls and the incredible power that we have, and that we are creatures of light and that everything is consciousness. Instead, we feel stuck in this material universe, and we feel that we can be easily wiped out, and our lives don't matter, and we're afraid of other human beings. And when you get in the vortex like that, even if you're somebody who practices spiritually, you can lose all the spiritual stability that you've developed at the snap of the fingers if it's the right trauma trigger. how do you get out of that? They wrote about that too. Well, there's a few ways. One was called foredetermination. And she gave the example of, so for instance, if you walk into a sick room, if you go in there and you're a hypochondriac, you're in trouble. But if you bring your world into the sick room, your world of health, you can help the sick person by your life force just being there with them. And another way that you could deal with the vortex that they teach is to pull back to a bird's eye view. So something happens that scares you, you don't know what to do. Stop, meditate, pull yourself to your center, remember what you are, and then you will see what the best action may be. And again, relaxed appreciation, because that goes away. When you're in the vortex and you're in the lower soul, you don't appreciate life. Birds, they make a mess. They carry diseases. The trees, it's a problem for insurance because they won't cover the roots and the pipes. Everything takes on this kind of degraded quality that's always a problem. And relaxed appreciation helps you to remember what you truly are and how beautiful the world truly is. So you bring back to your memory all the things that you love about life, beautiful places, beautiful people, beautiful feelings, your best moments, and you remember how glorious it is to be alive. And that also can help us to pull out of the vortex. And this power of appreciation, the invisibles taught, is one of the great forces in the universe. They have this phrase that I really like for it. They call it a radiance of the power of love. That's what appreciation is, the radiance of the power of love. And they said for every tragic event in the news every day, and all those tragedies that never get reported, there are countless acts of kindness that combine like instruments in an orchestra to lift up life. And appreciation is at the heart of this, opening the senses, focusing awareness on the present moment, inspiring feelings of joy. I will share with you a technique that Stewart used, which I think is wonderful. It's also a beautiful little piece of writing. He says, I evolved and grew into a little daily routine. I would begin by lying flat on my back, preferably on the floor because of its more stable support. Then for a brief space, I would picture to myself various relaxing things. A dog flopped asleep in the sunshine. A cat stretched out before the fire. A coat on a coat hanger. The sensation of floating in warm water or of falling comfortably through space. For example, I would repeatedly divert my attention to little discontinuous noises, a bird singing, the creaking of the woodwork, the wind passing in the trees. And this would bring an awareness of the present moment and a great purity, a feeling of this awareness shining, like pure awareness. He says, it had occurred to me that when one looks or listens or feels with his whole mind, he doesn't think. Sometimes I would use memory pictures as the substitute. A tiny brook murmuring contentedly among the giant sugar pines. A green meadow in the enchanted silence of the forest depths. Thin rose clouds streaking a sunset sky. The shimmer of moonlight upon the summer sea. These and their kind I would pursue until the thrill and the wonder of beauty had closed gentle fingers around my consciousness. Now, this imagery, when Betty was asked, so what's the difference between where you are, like consciousness where you are and where we are? And she used the example. She said, you know, when you're camping at night and you can't see a thing, you might be able to see the stars overhead, but maybe not even that. You can only see a few feet and there's no color. Everything's very gray. She said, that's your world to us. That's what it looks like to us. She said, now when the sun comes up, all of a sudden the entire world becomes color, and you can see far away, way, way far away. And all of a sudden you're surrounded with life and beauty and sound. And she said, that's what our world is like. That change of consciousness from that nighttime of kind of closed in and not very colorful living, and then suddenly that opening of the horizons and all the color that suddenly shows up. She said, we see so much more than you do. She also said that, very touching, I think, that we love to, like spirits love to walk in the garden, that, they love to come to Earth, and they see more of nature than we do. And they love Mother Earth. They love this place as this place where we learn and where our individuality is born. And it's so filled with beauty. And so I think that's a wonderful depiction of it. And trying to get there, Stewart now wanted to feel that, how do I become a molecule of consciousness while I'm still alive, so I can feel that? So he had another meditation. He would like to picture himself floating unanchored in space, as he put it. He liked to picture a bird gliding way above the ground, or an airplane in space touching nothing, a balloon in the stratosphere. One picture that he found particularly effective was smoke rising slowly and hanging under the ceiling. He said as long as he centered on these, his thoughts would not disturb him. And then he said, very carefully, I would detach myself from my symbols and try to sense myself as a disembodied point of consciousness in space. He said, surprisingly, this wasn't too hard to do, though at first the effect stayed with me only for an instant. I love that he describes this attainment of consciousness outside form so nonchalantly, in the same way that he described the wilderness and his incredible experiences in the Serengeti and such. And he reminds us that don't get too serious about this, because the practice defeats the purpose. Like if you're really serious, you lose it. And this reminds me of a recent scientific study that showed that we learn more quickly when we play. We can repeat something 2 or 3 times when we play and we get it. But if we go after it very seriously with great discipline, we have to repeat it over and over and over and over again. And there was also an experiment done that you may know about where they took a bunch of housewives basically and said, play psychic. And they were really good. But the minute they took themselves seriously, they were terrible. And so Stewart points out this playfulness is so essential to all of these paths. And when you lose that playfulness, then you lose a lot of that magic of the expanded consciousness. I like when they talked about prayer, for example. How do you pray? And the Invisibles were funny. They were like, okay, first of all, throw away all that boring. It reminded me of Monty Python, when God says, no more psalms, so depressing. And they said, forget about all that and start with relaxed appreciation. And then they asked Betty, well, how do you pray? And she said, think of yourself as someone who's drowning, and there's a bunch of people on a nearby yacht who could save you. She said, that's prayer. And then she said, and then they said, well, but what are we praying to? And she said, pray to consciousness. And that really struck me because it kind of reduces all religions to idolatry in a way, right? Because she's not saying this particular teacher or this particular symbol. She's saying what we're after is a consciousness greater than our own. Isn't that what we're all seeking? A consciousness that's wiser and more merciful than we are. So when you pray, start with appreciation and then admit your desperation and your faith that help is there, and then pray to consciousness greater than your own. It's really quite a lovely thing. And that's how you develop spiritual contact. And through spiritual contact, steadily keeping that going, you develop spiritual sure-footedness. And that serves you not only when you die, but in this life, because when you go through life with spiritual sure-footedness, you can deal with very difficult situations in a way that people who don't have that advantage can't. There's a book called The Stars Are Still There that Stewart wrote, and had letters from people, including a bereaved family whose 2 dogs were murdered by some criminal, and they asked, what happens to our beloved dogs? And so he said that he asked Betty that question, and this is what Betty answered. She said that all animals are born from a quality of consciousness. So cats have a quality of consciousness that is cat. And so do dogs and trees and rats. I mean, everything has a quality. And she said, now, if the cat doesn't have an opportunity to develop individuality, it doesn't really develop will or reason. It just kind of tries to struggle to survive. It will just return to that quality of consciousness, and it doesn't really build on that. But any animal that attains will and reason, that develops a personality, she said, they carry on as individuals. They are on that great evolutionary path, spiritual path that we are all on. And Betty said that eventually, as they expand their consciousness more and more as dogs and reincarnating as dogs, they will finally reach a point where they're the ultimate dog. They can't get any more conscious, and then they will graduate to another form. And so apparently, they didn't come out and say this, but apparently we've all done that journey. We've gone from amoeba and all the way up through various plants and animals, and to get that human body. Another thing I would like to mention to people who watch this or listen to this is they had the Invisibles talked about what they call 2 Neanderthal superstitions. I think this is kind of delightful. And they said that this really inhibits human life. And the first Neanderthal superstition is the belief that youth, physical beauty, and strength are more important than anything. And the second is that aging enfeebles the mind and the soul. So what they were teaching was that there's a couple of interesting points to this. One is that the way we should age is that our bodies are like the fruit that ripens around the seed of the soul. So as the body weakens, the soul becomes stronger. And they taught ways to deal with this. So, for instance, they would say, when you get older and something is blocked off from you, many people give up at that point. But what you're supposed to do is find a way for the flow to go in a new way. Find something new to do. And let your soul breathe. Let your soul grow, because you're getting younger as you get older. Because the more that your soul grows, the younger you become, because the soul is the essence of your youth. And they also said that this aging itself, they described as superstition. That essentially we have over generations taught ourselves to age in a certain way, to all do it together, because that's how we're supposed to do it. And I know we've discussed this before in other conversations we've had, how you may meet someone of a certain age and you think, my Lord, that's a hard 50 right there. And then you meet somebody who's 50 and they're 25. And it's so strikingly different. And yet most people feel, oh no, I'm 30 now, or I'm 40 now, or at this age, this is going to happen to me. And of course we have a system that just feeds and on that. And, we have insurance companies that tell us that these diseases are more prone to happen, and all these things that put us into a state of mind where we are superstitiously creating this enfeebling experience of age, instead of experiencing the empowerment that the soul getting more and more powerful gives us. And I think that the other thing that they pointed out about it that's interesting is that this is a form of cutting ourselves off from our source. Because when we surrender to this idea that we are becoming enfeebled and that there's nothing but something bad ahead of us, then we lose touch with the soul. So they used to say, for example, let's say you're tired, your body's tired, it's sore. Fine. Do something with your mind, do something with your imagination. Let the body rest. Pamper the body. Gently guide the body away from the things that harm it or cause it to feel bad, and encourage the things that make you feel energized. Really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And so they, of course, ask, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? We've seen a little bit of this in what we've been discussing, but they came out with this concept, which was partly based on ideas in Our Unseen Guest. And I think this is wonderful. It's one of my favorite things that I found in AMR. And this is the difference between quality and quantity of consciousness we've already mentioned. Our job, the meaning of life, is learning to conduct an ever greater flow of consciousness. And so we exist in our quality of consciousness when we incarnate. We can't change it. Once you incarnate as a human, you're stuck for that life. You can't change your quality. But you have the power to amass as much consciousness as you can in this life. So, what you're doing is like an incredible service, giving people a means of acquiring more and more consciousness from all these wonderful interviews that you do. And ultimately, when we do that, we achieve not only better incarnations as human beings as we mature and more conscious incarnations, but eventually we mature right out of incarnation because we have become the ultimate that we can be.
I know the teachings go on and on. There are thousands of pages, I understand, of channelings. I wonder if we shouldn't consider a second interview where we go into more detail of some of these higher teachings.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm always happy to talk about them. I think that there's a lot of very useful and comforting material in there. Yeah. For instance, just to briefly touch it, they answer the question of how does consciousness create forms? And they use the term juxtaposition, which is that's when we put things together, time, place, all the peculiarities of the material world. We pick things that have never been put together before, and we create something. We have this thing that happens in the obstructed world, and then we sustain it by what they called intraposition. So you juxtapose to create your body, and then you intrapose to keep it alive, to sustain it. And so if as long as that body that is created in that moment of conception by juxtaposition is alive, it's kept alive by intraposition, by that vital connection of the soul that's giving the harmony, the life force, the structure, the color, everything is given coherence that way. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that maybe what we do is, I kind of wanted to go deeply into the comparisons with the Unobstructed Secret, but if we're going to do another one, I'd like to save that, and also the comparisons to Plato, which are stunning. Really amazing. And so we can look at Plato, the Golden Flower, and the Unobstructed Universe teachings, and they really help us to understand all three. It must be that this is human nature, because these things were written thousands of years apart in the case of Plato, hundreds of years apart in the case of the Golden Flower, different continents, different language, completely different cultures, and yet what's described is strikingly similar.
It'll be an exciting interview, and my sense is we'll give our viewers an opportunity to digest as much as we've covered this far, which is actually quite a lot. We're covering many, many years of Stewart Edward White and Betty White's work. But I think a second interview will be a great way to top it off.
Well, I would love to do that. And I will, I think, leave it on this note from Betty, because I think it's so poignant, and I want people to sit with it. Betty and the Betty books, the Invisibles, always advised and tried to inspire us to make the most out of our lives. And Betty left us this poignant confession by a woman who lived a life of yachts, mansions, safaris, glamorous parties, wilderness hikes, and who knew the kind of love that, this is a legendary love. Really an amazing love affair. She wrote, "My precious sensibilities, I haven't half enough of them. I hunt around among my deepest and tenderest feelings, my intensest longings, all the parts of me that are most quivered with life. I wish there was a lot more. They make such a little bit of building material. It would be terrible to come over without any intensities to build on. I feel the difference, just as you can tell electric current or when it's shut off, just as definite as that. The current is the intensity that runs through to our pleasures and beliefs and longings, the permeation of the spirit, which is so difficult to put into convincing words." So when she says that, it leaves all of us thinking, oh my, let's use our lives to have these exhilarating experiences so we have something to build on when we cross over.
Well, Ronnie, this has been a fabulous interview. It has depth. It has wisdom. It has a wonderful historical episode of the spiritual life in America during the Second World War and before, actually during the period of the two world wars. Thank you so much for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.